welcome again. If I didn't get a chance to greet you personally as a group, welcome to this second in a series on Gioachino Rossini, leading up to our production of the Barber of Seville, as Darren pointed out, is opening next weekend. The first performance of the opera is the 25th, Sunday evening, and of course the night before we have the concert with soloists and the chorus from the San Diego Opera. So very, very busy spring festival coming up, all centered around this wonderful composer, Gioachino Rossini. And last week, we talked about his background, some of the things that were going on during his time politically. We understand that the area where he was born, the Marche, traded hands politically with the Papal States and the Roman Republic, and then the Republic of Ancona, and then its own thing, and then back to Napoleonic era under Murat, and it was just constantly in flux. Well, that is a wonderful metaphor for what was happening in the arts and what was happening in music. Everything is in flux, and I think a wonderful example of that were the paintings that we looked at. And up to the turn of the 19th century, neoclassicism and classicism was all the rage. Everything perfectly proportioned, all of the figures and the draperies beautifully rendered, all as realistic as possible. And then suddenly, who burst onto the scene but painters like Delacroix, Goya, Géricault, who are all sort of getting very painterly and are being influenced by romanticism with a large R, and the overwhelming power of nature, and excitement and movement and action and tragedy as it happens. So Rossini is in the middle of all of this. Now, I won't say that Rossini ever truly becomes a romantic. I would never call Rossini a romantic composer, even though that he lasted well into the 1850s in terms of his life. The last opera he wrote was 1829 with William Tell, but it doesn't really come close to the transition that the young Verdi makes with his first operas in the late 1830s and early 1840s, and goes over the brink with romanticism. And really explores the darkness and the angst, the anxiety of the age, along with Wagner, who's pretty much doing the same thing except with a Teutonic accent, right? So Rossini doesn't quite go that far, but he's certainly affected by all of the things that are happening around him, all of these artistic movements around him. He's very much aware. And he's careful. He is very much steeped in the 18th century opera buffa or comic opera tradition of composers like Paisiello and Cimarosa. Paisiello and Cimarosa were the most important composers of Italian opera buffa or comic opera prior to Rossini. Rossini knew the music of these composers, and they were very much in a neoclassical vein. But their operas became very formulaic and actually became quite boring, and even audiences and critics were recognizing that the new works by Paisiello and Cimarosa in the late 18th century, we're talking 1780s, 1790s, were just not up to snuff. They weren't exciting audiences as they had excited them a generation before. And so there was a slump in comic opera with Rossini, and Rossini just sort of takes over. I mean, the chalkboard was blank, and in he comes and starts writing comic operas, especially in his earlier career, and doing extraordinary things. So we're going to look at that, and we're particularly going to look at the singers who influenced him. So I would like, first of all, to introduce you. I'm going to share the screen. I want to introduce you to some of the characters that we're going to be talking about today, beginning, of course, with Rossini himself. And here is a rather early portrait of the young composer, Gioachino Rossini, dressed in an outfit that is much like the outfit described when he went to the premiere of The Barber of Seville. One of the critics who was at that first disastrous performance that we talked about last week, or maybe we didn't. No, I'll talk about it next week. Anyway, it was a complete fiasco, absolute disaster. And one of the things that the critic pointed out was that Rossini was wearing a colorful orange and green coat. Well, I think this is the coat. But that same coat also had huge gold buttons on it. And it was very ostentatious. And so the critic, instead of talking about the opera and the music and the dramaturgy or the performances of the singers, was talking about how Rossini dressed. So at this point in 1816, the premiere of The Barber of Seville, Rossini was doing pretty well. He had had a number of successes under his belt, and he was able to dress well. And so he had the money. He started to buy nice clothes. And this is a wonderful example of that. I don't know how true to life this particular portrait is. I had actually never seen it before. I did a search for the young Rossini, an image search, and this popped up, and I'd never seen it before, but so there it is. This portrait is a little bit more famous. It's a little bit more typical of the portraits of the period. You notice it has a kind of neoclassical form. As we talked about last week, the figure is centered. His chin bifurcates the canvas, right in the center of the canvas. It's perfectly balanced, and he's not showing any emotion. There's no emotion there except perhaps a kind of self-satisfaction. And even at this point, Rossini was becoming extraordinarily well known, certainly throughout northern Italy and in Vienna, where he had already had a couple of successes. So he was doing quite well. And you see him dressed here. He's probably in his early 30s at this point in this portrait, and doing pretty well for himself. And as you recall from last week, he studied in Bologna. He went to the music conservatory in Bologna, which was led by the son of one of the teachers of Mozart. So he felt a kinship with Mozart, studied Mozart's scores, studied Haydn's scores, and really learned a lot from his studies. In fact, his teacher, Padre Mattei, called him Il Tedeschino, the little German. He called him the little German because he studied Haydn and Mozart and loved the Austrian masters of Mozart and Haydn. So let's look at some of the other characters that I'm going to be talking about today. Perhaps his greatest vocal influence. Here is the shyster, Domenico Barbaglio. Barbaglio was the director of the Teatro San Carlo, the big opera house in Napoli. The big opera house in Napoli. And Barbaglio was something of a shyster. Barbaglio would hire composers to write 2 operas a year for the Teatro San Carlo. But that wasn't the end of their responsibilities. They also had to direct all of the rehearsals of all the other operas that the Teatro San Carlo would do that year. They also sometimes had to be drawn in to write the recitatives of a new opera by another composer, or write occasional arias and ensembles where there were blanks to fill in with operas by other composers. And he hired these composers at a very, very cheap rate and for a lengthy amount of time. So in 1815, Barbaglio, having already experienced The Italian Girl in Algiers, Rossini's very brilliant and very successful early opera, L'Italiana in Algeri, Barbaio went after Rossini and he says, here, I'll give you a 7-year contract in Napoli, compose 2 operas a year for me, and take care of all the rest as well. Well, Rossini jumped at it. Why? Because Naples, was the center of comic opera. In fact, the center of opera in many, many ways. But certainly they had the greatest singers in their stable of singers of any place in Europe. Barbaio was very good at being able to get the best talent to come to Naples. It was also the home company of both Paisiello and Cimarosa, those 2 older Italian composers of comic opera. So, of course, Rossini, in his early 20s, wants to get a contract at the Teatro San Carlo, and off he goes. This is a building that I know very well because I visit Napoli almost every year. Of course, not this last year because of the pandemic. But this is the Palazzo of Domenico Barbaio. And you may see at the bottom on the right-hand side of the arch, of the arched entranceway, a little tourist sign. And that sign says Palazzo di Domenico Barbaio, the intendant or director of the Teatro San Carlo. And we had to pass this, you have to pass this building every time you want to go to the Piazza del Plebiscito or the Opera House. San Carlo is only a brief walk from this palazzo. It's also right next door to the Galleria Umberto I, which is this huge shopping mall that was built in the late 19th century. Absolutely gorgeous. But this is where Barbaia lived, and he had the entire building. Now it's cut up into apartments or condos, but he had that entire building. So he made plenty of money in opera, and he was the man who brought Gioachino Rossini to Naples. Now I want to introduce you to the person who was, I think, single-handedly responsible for Rossini's growth as a vocal composer, and that is this woman, Isabella Colbran. She was born in Madrid, in Spain, in 1785, so she's about 7 years older than Rossini, and showed musical promise as a singer very, very early on. She was described in her early adulthood as tall, beautifully proportioned, a Spanish beauty, in the words of a contemporary critic. And as you can see here, she was quite beautiful, and she's often seen holding a lyre. This was not an uncommon symbol for singers particularly, and for other kinds of musical artists to be holding when their portraits were painted, just like this portrait of the same singer, Isabella Colbran, at the height of her career. Now, Rossini heard her at the Accademia Filarmonica in Bologna when he was studying there. As early as 1806, Rossini is 14. So Colbran is 20, and she gives a recital at the conservatory where he's studying. And evidently, she just knocked him off his feet when he heard her. He was absolutely entranced with her voice and with what she was able to do with this very rich voice. Her voice is said to have had a 3-octave range. Think of it, a 3-octave range that was warm and rich in color, with great facility and flexibility. Now that sounds like today's star mezzo-sopranos, like Marilyn Horne and Joyce DiDonato, who we're going to hear from later on, because they sing some of the literature that was created for this singer, Isabella Colbran. Now, Colbran was one of those singers who was in the stable of soloists at the Teatro San Carlo in Naples when Rossini was hired. So you can imagine Rossini's delight when he's hired by Domenico Barbaia to come from Bologna to live in Naples for 7 years and be under contract to write music for this great singer who he's already heard in Bologna. I mean, I imagine his heart skipped a few beats when he realized that he was going to be able to write music for this woman. He wrote no less than 11 operas in Naples for Isabella Colbran. They include Elisabetta Regina d'Inghilterra, or Elizabeth the Queen of England, Otello, Armida, Moses in Egypt, Mosè in Egitto, Ricciardo e Zoraida, Ermione, La Donna del Lago, or The Lady of the Lake, based on a Walter Scott poem, Maometto II, Zelmira, and then finally Semiramide. Now, you may notice, first of all, that you don't know of any of those operas, or maybe you've heard of one or two of them. You may also notice none of them are comedies. None of them. Isabella Colbran was not a comedienne. What she was singularly capable of was creating drama and pathos on stage. And so the operas that Rossini wrote for her were all opera serie, or tragic operas. So all of these operas, Elizabeth, Othello, Ermione, The Lady of the Lake, Maometto II, and Semiramide, which was a big failure for her and why she retired from the opera stage in 1824. They're all tragedies. They're all tragedies. So none of the comic operas that Rossini wrote were written specifically for her, but she was said to be what we call a soprano sfogato. That's S-F-O-G-A-T-O, sfogato, S-F-O-G-A-T-O, meaning to vent with air, venting, a soprano with air, literally. A soprano, or we would describe her today as a mezzo-soprano with a high upper extension, with incredible ability for coloratura, fioriture, very flexible voice, and that upper extension which acted like another voice, a separate voice from the chest voice and the middle voice. Three separate areas of singing, and able to mix those areas beautifully with no break. I mean, she must have been absolutely incredible. But despite the fact that he didn't write any comedies for her, he learned a lot about writing for the female voice while writing for her. Now, this is a late portrait of Colbran after she had married Rossini, moved to Bologna, and retired. She became a composer, and she wrote a number of songs. So here she is shown in the portrait as a composer at the keyboard, and on the music desk, one of her collections of songs, which she was very proud of. She wrote 4 collections of songs, and I'm sure she got lots of inspiration from Rossini. They separated in 1837 because Rossini took up with a French model, Olympe Pellessier. Colbran dies in 1845, whereupon Rossini marries Olympe Pellessier, and he dies married to her in Paris. There are 2 more singers I want to point out to you. Marietta Margolina, who was the first Isabella in Italian Girl, which was Rossini's earliest success. And then finally, Geltrude Righetti Giorgi. And she was the first Cenerentola. She was the first Angelina or Cinderella for Rossini when he wrote that opera in 1817. So those are some of the characters that we're going to be talking about. but I kind of wanted to give you an idea of what some of these people looked like, and then start talking about them and start talking about this literature. From here on in, we're going to do a lot of listening because I think there's so much to hear in this absolutely charming world of the Rossini comedy. There's so much to listen to, and there's so much that attracts the ear. But I think the most important thing to ask, and that really is the subject of today's talk, is why did Rossini choose to give the comic roles in L'Italiana in Algeri, Il Turca in Italia, Il Barbiere di Siviglia, and in La Cenerentola, the great comedies of Rossini? Why did he choose to write these heroines as mezzo-sopranos or as contraltos? I think the thing that connects all of these characters, all four of them, Cinderella, Rosina, Isabella, oh, I'm sorry, who's the other one? Oh, in Turco in Italia, I forget the name of the main character in that opera. They're all contraltos. They're all mezzo-sopranos. Why? Because they're all very strong characters. They all have a heart of steel. Rosina, in her aria Una voce poco fa, she talks about, vincerò, I will win. Men think that, and I'm very shy and I'm very pliable and I act the feminine character with all the men in my life. But, if you touch me the wrong way, I'll turn into a viper. And we hear this in the music. And coiled up, I'll turn into a viper, coiled up, and I'll strike out at the man who crosses my path. Oh boy, she's serious. And she really takes over. She really takes over. She's a comic character, but she's also incredibly independent. The same thing with Isabella in L'Italiana in Algeri, who is shipwrecked in Algeria, and the Mustafa, the Caliph, is after her in marriage, but she's in love with Lindoro. She's in love with somebody else. In her opening aria at the beginning of the opera, when she's on the beach, shipwrecked, she says pretty much the same thing. No, you guys. I know how to twist a man around my little finger. I know how this is going to end. And by golly, that's exactly how it ends. She's a very, very strong character. So the quality of the mezzo-soprano or contralto voice is all important to Rossini. The quality of that voice with that ability to go below the staff and have what we call a chest voice that is very powerful, has a lot of penetration to it. In fact, Marilyn Horne's chest voice sounds to me like the higher register of a tenor. It sounds like a male voice when she goes down into her lower register. It's really incredible. And yet all of that coloration is there as well. All of that facility for coloratura is there as well. And that's what Rossini learned from Colbran. This is what the human voice is capable of. But the color he wanted for these comic roles, like Lucille Ball and Lucy. I love Lucy. She's a very strong character, right? I mean, she may act, kind of ditzy and all of that, but she always wins, right? I mean, it's that kind of comic character. It's right out of Commedia dell'arte. It's right out of classic commedia. And so it makes sense to my ear that Rossini would want to have these heroines be mezzo-sopranos. Now, the first thing I'd like you to listen to is from a later opera. This is from 1819, from a Sir Walter Scott poem, The Lady of the Lake, La Donna del Lago. This is one of the first works that brings British Romanticism through Sir Walter Scott to Italy, across the Channel and into Italy, and ends up becoming the inspiration for Lucia di Lammermoor, right, by Donizetti. This is based on a Sir Walter Scott novel. That, you know, the craggy highlands in Scotland, to the Italian audiences, this was, oh my God, that's as exotic as could possibly be. And it's filled with ideas of the supernatural, and it's very dark and gothic. Well, Rossini made an attempt with this serious opera, La Donna del Lago, that he wrote for Isabella Colbran. Certain performances, the audiences disliked the opera because they found it too loud. That the use of trumpets on stage was too much, too distracting, decadent. The music was too decadent. It was too sumptuous. It was too big. It used too luxurious an orchestra, choral sound. As I said, trumpets on stage. It was subsequent audiences eventually thought, you know, it's actually quite good. So as we listen to this second half of an aria from La Donna del Lago, Tanti Affetti is the name of the aria, and this is Joyce Di Donato in a live performance. I want you to keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, what the critics just said about too much orchestra, all right? And by the way, notice the faces of some of the orchestra members behind Ms. Di Donato, absolutely stunned by her ability. But the other thing I want you to keep in mind is that this was written specifically for Isabella Colbran. I think this example will tell you everything you need to know about the exquisite nature of Isabella Colbran's vocal ability and why she was so influential on Rossini, not only as a singer, but eventually as his wife. Kevin, let's take a listen to Tanti Affetti from the daughter of the Lady of the Lake.
O chi spera potia, o chi spera potia, tanta felicità, tanta felicità.
Isn't that fun? Can you imagine what audiences were thinking when they heard this? Now, here's a perfect example of a soprano sfogato, right? I think Joyce Donato is a perfect example of that. She's got all three of those octaves. You heard extraordinarily low notes, as well as very, very high notes that, you know, typically would be soprano territory, maybe even coloratura soprano territory. So that was the genius of Isabella Colbran. I want to address a couple of the questions. First of all, I apologize for not going back to full screen. I promise to try and do that next week, and I'll put the names underneath the pictures so that if I use portraits next week, I'm so sorry about that. 2 operas a year, is that a lot to compose? Not in the early 19th century. And particularly not for Rossini. And I think for Rossini that was probably one too few. There were a couple of years in that era where he wrote 3 operas in one year. He was very fast, very, very fast. I'll say a little bit more about that in the next 3 excerpts that we're going to listen to, but he worked quickly. So for Rossini, no. Today, that would be extraordinary. 2 operas in a year, unless they're one-act operas and they're only maybe a half hour long. But operas back then, you know, were expected to be an entire evening of entertainment. The question, how were women singers trained in that era, at conservatories or privately? Most often, they were trained privately. Like Colbran, I do not believe went to a conservatory. She studied with the finest teachers of singing that she could find. So, you know, that was not an issue. Conservatories, I don't think were as set up for singers back then as instrumentalists were, or as composers were. Those are the people who would typically go to conservatories at that time. Singers, more often than not, apprenticed. That's how they learned how to be opera singers. They apprenticed themselves to an opera singer or a teacher of singing and just lived with them, or spent a lot of time with them, followed them around from opera house to opera house, and that's how they learned. Okay, I think that's it for questions. I want to continue. I want to play you a brief excerpt of the very first opera that Rossini wrote for Naples, for the Teatro San Carlo, after he had been hired by Domenico Barbaia. So this was the first opera that he wrote for Isabella Colbran. And it was Elizabeth, the Queen of England. Elisabetta Regina l'Inghilterra. It was written in 1815, which was the first year of his contract with Napoli. And it is extraordinary. Teatro San Carlo, as today, had a brilliant orchestra, and so Rossini wrote for the orchestra. He makes sure that the orchestra is an equal partner with the voice. Equal, equal, equal. That's extremely important. So Teatro San Carlo has a great orchestra, I'm going to write for a great orchestra as well as for the great voice. The reception of Elisabetta was rapturous. And it made Rossini's name in Naples, where the 2 reigning composers were Paisiello and Cimarosa. Cimarosa had died already. Paisiello was to die a little later. But Rossini was triumphant, as well was Isabella Colbran. Now, we talk about how quickly it took Rossini to write The Barber of Seville. You're going to hear one of the reasons that he wrote The Barber of Seville in just a matter of, 3 weeks or something. This is one of the reasons. This is the Cavalletta from Elizabeth's Act 1 aria. Now this is a recording, it's not a video, so all you're going to see is the cover of the recording. And it's a recording of arias written for Isabella Colbran by various singers. But the singer in this case is Joyce Di Donato again. This is Questa Corbin, and it's the cabaletta from that aria for Elizabeth in Elisabetta, Regina d'Inghilterra. Let's listen to this. Okay, be honest with me. How many of you recognized that music? Raise your hand. Yeah, it's the same material, the same tune as the second half of Rosina's aria in The Barber of Seville, which was written 6 months later. And as I said last week, I think I said it last week, or maybe I recorded it for the video that we're doing for the production. I don't remember anymore. That he borrowed also the overture to Elizabeth for The Barber of Seville. But listen to this. This is the cabaletta from Una voce poco fa. Recognize that? Yeah? That's Una voce poco fa. He stole it directly, that tune at least. It's treated differently, but he steals that tune directly from Elizabeth and uses it in The Barber of Seville. He just slows it down. very simple, stealing from himself as well as the entire overture. And that's what Rossini felt about the difference between tragic opera and comic opera. You know, that bubbly, joyful overture that we know of as the Barber of Seville overture was used as an introduction to the tragedy Elizabeth, the Queen of England. That made no difference to Rossini whatsoever. Absolutely none. Now, a word about the instruments. Did you hear the trumpets, the brass, the wind instruments in both of the excerpts that we've heard? Critics of the day had this to say about Rossini's use of the orchestra. The tempest of notes, not leaving you a moment to breathe, the timpani, the pipes, the trumpets, the horns, and the entire family of the noisiest instruments assault you, transport you, trick you, intoxicate you, and many times transmute a sort of tragedy into a bacchanalia, a house of mourning into a festivity. I can't tell whether he's complaining or rejoicing in the fact that Rossini loves the colors of the instruments and loves what the colors of those instruments has to say about the drama, or about, in this case, about the comedy. Now, here's another example from L'Italiana in Algeri, or An Italian Girl in Algiers. The main character, Isabella, originally sung by the mezzo-soprano Marietta Margolini, who we saw a picture of earlier, is shipwrecked, and she's surrounded by men. And in this wonderful aria, particularly in this cabaletta from Cruda Sorte, she essentially says, yeah, never mind, I'll take care of all this. And all the strength is not only in the music, all the strength of this character, it's also in the color of her voice, as heard in this excerpt sung by Marilyn Horne. This is from 1813, very, very early in Rossini's career, still considered one of his great masterpieces of comic opera. Let's listen to Marilyn Horne sing the cabaletta of Cruda Sorte. first time, it sounds like that. The second time, she changes the vowel ever so slightly, Marilyn Horne. Si, 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 si. She's not, she's not going to be fooled around with by any man. You know, she changes the color of that yes, 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 yes to yeah, right, baby. I'm taking control of this situation. And it's all there. It's all in the music. It is absolutely brilliant. Kevin, I'm going to skip the next video and go to the final one from Cenerentola. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit first. But just so you're prepared, we don't have time for Per Lui, which is from this same opera, and we don't need to continue. Let's just go to Cenerentola. But I want to answer a couple of questions that were here. At San Carlo, composers were hired, then they could choose any libretto or suggestions were given. That's a really good question, and the answer is both. Sometimes the intendant, the director, in this case Domenico Barbaglia, he won in an opera based on a particular subject, and he would get a librettist and he would pair him up with Rossini. But Rossini was the final word, especially after the premiere of Elisabetta, Regina d'Inghilterra. He had that power, and he could say, no, I'm not interested, I want to do this libretto. So it was usually a discussion, and it could be very heated. In most opera houses in Italy, I would say that the director of the opera house probably had more power than the typical composer. But in the case of Rossini, after that success, no, Rossini had carte blanche. He could do anything he wanted. And Laurie, again, welcoming us to the Public Library's online catalog for recordings and scores related to our season, San Diego Opera season. So please, and again, I welcome all of you folks who are here from the library, from the Central Library website. I apologize, I didn't greet you at the beginning of the lecture. I had so many notes and books and scores in front of me, I completely forgot. But again, thank you, Laurie, for your generous help. There was one other question. Oh, where the Joyce Di Donato example was filmed, La Donna del Lago. That was a summer festival in Austria. Grafenegg. Grafenegg is the name of the palace, and there's a little outdoor festival there. All right, let's go to La Cenerentola, which is written after the Barber of Seville, 1817. Of course, it's based on the story of Cinderella. There's a famous story told by the librettist of La Cenerentola, Jacopo Ferretti, who said that he was having a long discussion over tea into the night with Rossini, what the libretto was going to be for this opera that they were going to compose together. And they had all sorts of suggestions. They went for hours. Finally, Rossini gets on his bedclothes, goes to bed, and starts to fall asleep. And Ferretti says, what about Cinderella? And Rossini sits up in his bed under the covers. He said, are you brave enough to write a libretto of Cinderella? And Ferretti said back to him, are you brave enough to write the music? Let's see. And the next day he had a scenario, and in 23 days or something, they had La Cenerentola written. This was written for the mezzo-soprano, again, that we saw a picture of earlier, Geltrude Riglietti Giorgi. She was a very well-known mezzo-soprano in the early 19th century and was just brilliant. This is the final cabaletta where Cinderella has gone through the ball. She's been fitted with the slipper, which is not true to the libretto. But anyway, most modern performances use the glass slipper because that's what we're familiar with, at least in Great Britain and in the United States. And all is well, but she's got this family that treated her badly, and she calms them down and says, sister, father, daughter, you're all my friends, all is forgiven, everything will be fine. The singer here is Ruxandra Donosa, who sang the role of Idamante for us here in San Diego when we did Idomeneo by Mozart. Again, this just shows you that as early as 1817, Rossini was writing incredibly brilliant music for coloratura, mezzo-soprano, and much of it, I'm sure, he learned from listening and working with Isabella Colbran. Let's listen to this brilliant finale of La Cenerentola.
Non più me sta canto al fuoco, starò sola gorgheggiar. No, fu lampo un sogno, un gioco, il mio lungo palpitar. Non più me sta accanto al fuoco, non più me sta accanto al fuoco, starò sola gorgheggiar. No, fu lampo un sogno, un gioco, il mio lungo palpitar. Non più me sta accanto al fuoco, non più me sta accanto al fuoco, starò solo gorgheggiar. Fu lampo un sogno, un gioco, il mio lungo palpitar. Fu lampo un sogno, un gioco, fu lampo un sogno, il mio lungo palpitar. Fu lampo un sogno, un gioco, fu lampo un sogno, il mio lungo
I think that Cinderella is going to eat the prince for dinner. That is a very strong character indeed, based on that music. Very resolute, very strong-willed, and that's how she gets through everything that she gets through in this story. And speaking of borrowing, Elisabetta was written in 1815, Barber was written in 1816, and Rossini borrowed a few things from Elisabetta for Barber. Cenerentola is written in 1817, and he borrows a couple of things from Barber for Cenerentola. The tune you just heard is used as the cabaletta, or final portion, of Almaviva's final aria in the last few moments of the Barber of Seville. So yeah, little bit of borrowing here and there helps him write these things a little faster, but it's not enough to really say that, yeah, he borrowed, so it was easy for him to write La Cenerentola. No, 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 no. Or he borrowed extensively from Elisabetta, so it was easy for him to write the Barber of Seville. No, 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 no. These are just moments, and they're not the same. He uses them as source material and then develops and works with that music so that it absolutely fits to the character of the present opera that he's working on. We have come to, oh my goodness, 4:03. I've gone 3 minutes over. I'm sorry, but we covered, I think, just about everything that I want to cover, and gives you, I think, terrific background for talking about the Barber of Seville specifically next week. We will only talk about the Barber of Seville, so it will be an hour-long approach to that opera, and that plus the 7-minute video that I've prepared as the pre-talk for the actual production will fill you in on everything I think that you'll need to know for the Barber of Seville. So thank you all. It's been great being with you again and sharing this time in early 19th century opera buffa and Rossini. And what can I say? I'll see you at the opera, right? Ciao. Ciao tutti.